Thank you for joining. Okay, joining our first Ask a Scientist event on sustainable finance and forest biodiversity. It's the first time that we use this format of a Zoom meeting and not a webinar. So please make sure you have your microphones muted and also your videos banned. I'm Helga Pülzl, EFI's Assistant Director for Policy Support, and I have the honor today to moderate this event. I will talk to you, however, before about a couple of housekeeping issues and also introduce our scientist. So first of all, please be aware that this is a webinar. It is being recorded, and later on, we'll make it available on EFI's YouTube channel. For questions, we have prepared a Padlet where you can write down your questions for the speakers. The Padlet will be accessible on this link. I will share this now in the chat. And I would like to ask my colleague Shan to quickly introduce the Padlet to you so you can have a look and also open it for yourself.
Yes, so I will quickly share how you can use the Padlet to paste your questions. When you access the question link that we put into the chat box, you can see a question board like this, and we have divided it into different sections. If you have a general question to all the scientists, then you can ask your question here by simply clicking on this little plus button and then write your question, your name and organization, and then click on publish here on top. Then you will be able to put your questions here. If you have questions to the individual scientists, then you can also find the name of scientists and also their topic here. So you are also very welcome to ask your questions directly to the scientists by putting your questions here.
Thank you very much, Shan, for showing us quickly the Padlet. And finally, if you post on social media, please don't forget to use the hashtag ThinkForest or Ask a Scientist if you're posting. So, but before we start, let me introduce all our scientists. I will stop sharing so that actually all the faces of the scientists can be shown, and I would like you all to put your videos on so we can see you while I introduce you. Let me start out with Gert-Jan Nabuurs. He's professor of European forest resources at Wageningen University and Research. He's well known, so actually there is no need to introduce him, but I would still want to highlight that his background is in European scale forest resource analysis and management under climate change. Gert-Jan has published extensively, including in Nature and Science, and he's also coordinating lead author for IPCC. Gert-Jan is the coordinator of the study that we are discussing today, so welcome, Gert-Jan. Next to Gert-Jan, I would like to introduce Davide Petenella. He is professor in forest economics and policy and has more than 40 years of experience in research and teaching. Davide is a very well-accomplished scientist with a long publication list. So I would also not be able to tell you the most important publications because there are so many. His professional focus is on economics in forest products and services, with a particular interest in new markets, including sustainability and ethical views. Welcome, Davide. Next on the list is Yoan Paillet. He's a researcher in ecology and the French National Research Institute of Agriculture, Food and Environment, INRAE. He specialized in researching the links between biodiversity and forest management, with a special focus on structural features that are favorable to biodiversity. Yoan has an outstanding publication record, and we are very happy to have him with us. So welcome, Yoan. Then the next one on my list is Stefanie Linser. She's a senior scientist at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences, BOKU. where she is a leading expert on indicators of sustainable forest management and related data. Stefanie was also coordinating lead author of the State of Europe's Forest 2020 report. I assume she will be also at the next one. And she's also in the steering committee of the FAO Global Core set of forest-related indicators. So Stefanie is internationally really accomplished. A warm welcome to Stefanie. And the last but not the least one is Sophus to Ermgassen. Sophus is an ecologist, an ecological economist based in Oxford University, Nature Positive Hub. He specializes in biodiversity, market-based instrument, infrastructure sustainability, biodiversity finance, and biodiversity offsetting, and of course, ecological economics. Sophus, also the youngest in our scientist group, holds already 3 ongoing expert advisory roles with the UK government. He has also received an important early career award in 2023 and continues to publish in highly recognized journals. So thank you for being with us, Sophus. Now, without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Gert-Jan, who will give us a quick overview of the program and be our first speakers. So Gert-Jan, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Helga. And I hope you can hear me. There's a huge rainstorm here hammering on our building. So, but I'll try to speak a bit louder. Then I will share my screen. Yep. I assume you can see this. So this is indeed the study that Helga mentioned. How can we link the finance sector to forest biodiversity and forest biodiversity improvement as well? And what is the scientific background behind that? And this is what we did with the co-authors that Helga just introduced. So in the program this morning, we have 3 blocks with short introductions. So I'll give us first a very short introduction on sustainable finance, and then Davide Petenella will complement this first block on green finance. Then there is time for these questions with the Pedelec that was just introduced. And then there's the second block with short introductions on what forest biodiversity measures can you actually take, and what are the indicators for forest biodiversity, and how can we what can we say about these indicators if they need to be in a sustainable finance frame. That will be introduced by Yoan and Stefanie. Then there's questions again, and then there's a third block about targets to be set for forest biodiversity. Can we set targets, and how to do that in such a dynamic system? And then Sophus will complement the third block about green finance and financing green. So the first introduction, a short introduction. Well, there's basically no doubt that we are overusing our Earth resources. Here you see a graph that was published last year about how we are surpassing our planetary boundaries, that we're overusing our resources basically. And that has an impact, of course, on biodiversity. And the finance sector has a large share to do in do we improve biodiversity, or how do we use resources? Where do we invest in? So that has an impact on what is happening to biodiversity globally. And also forestry. So of course the finance sector is large and invests in many sectors, but also, well, to a small extent invests in forestry. And forestry, in the way you execute your measures, in the way you do your forest management, does have an impact on biodiversity. It can improve biodiversity, but it can also damage biodiversity. So investors have forests in their portfolio, but it's mostly about intensive production areas, like you see on the picture here from Vancouver Island and in the Douglas fir systems. Of course, these investors, they want to make financial return, and that's the type of forestry they invest in. Now, the Sustainable Finance Initiative, very briefly, in a few slides, these discussions in the EU already started around 2018, and so that aims to steer the investments to a transition to a greener society. And that goes through several regulations, and one of the regulations is the EU taxonomy regulation. And the taxonomy should set a common set of indicators for investors and policymakers to classify sustainable economic activities. So by setting your indicators and your targets, you could say, well, the big investment companies have to classify their investments in green and not so green. So under the taxonomy, there's also there will be a set of delegated acts, as they are called, delegated acts about these 6 environmental objectives that you see here in the slide. There's a climate delegated act, and there is and will be environmental delegated acts. And there is already a climate delegated act, and that already has some criteria to do no significant harm criteria that address biodiversity. So I have to very quickly go through here. One more thing to mention is the taxonomy. It does not make obligations that companies have to invest sustainably, but it's a disclosure rule. So companies have to disclose, they have to open up basically their investments and classify their investments by green and not so green. And this is what is called then the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, that companies have to import according to certain criteria and indicators their investments. And you can later on in the report that has been published already early this year, you can read this in much more detail. Very quickly, my last is that I mentioned that under the Climate Delegated Act, there is already a first set of indicators that address biodiversity and forest biodiversity. For example, it says that investment should ensure good conservation status of a habitat, should exclude the use of invasive alien species. It should ensure, for example, the quality of the soil, etc., etc. These are, of course, very broadly defined indicators, and we will later on here in the presentation by Stefanie a more elaborate set. So this is what we did in the study. We wanted to provide guidance for biodiversity-oriented forest management. What sort of management is that? We want to propose a set of quantitative indicators that are feasible, that are simple maybe also, and that push investments in a more biodiversity-friendly direction. And also say something about the monitoring and compliance options. And with that, I stop mine, and then I give the word to Davide.
Yes, thanks, Gerard. Can you check if you can see my presentation?
Yeah, it's good.
Visible? Okay, yeah. Perfect. So I'm speaking from Padua, north of Italy, sunny day, almost 30 degrees, wonderful environmental condition. And with this background, I try to give you some fundamental elements to define sustainability finance and sustainable or responsible investment in forestry. Traditionally, historically, the financial sector has not much been interested in the forestry sector, investing little capitals. That's has been due to the limited profit deriving from raw material production, especially wood, and the relevance of the environmental services provided by forest activity that are, from an economic point of view, not rival or not excludable services. So they are public goods not able to generate profit for the private sector. Some investment have been done through philanthropy, through donation, but a very limited scale. That's used to be the traditional financial landscape, but recent developments have changed this landscape. And that is due to two different groups of drivers. From the demand side, the presence of an informed civil society asking for a responsible activity by producer and inspired by criteria of responsible investments in buying products and services. From the supply side, many companies are now sharing values also with a long-term perspective, and they feel a threat for their business activity connected with the potential erosion of the reputational value connected with their brand. All this group of factors from the both side of demand and supply have pushed for investment, including biodiversity protection, climate change mitigation and adaptation, and more recently also the topic of land restoration, especially in the European Union. And that has been the background for important development of sustainable investment and sustainable finance activity in the forest sector. And you see, as a matter of fact, that many organizations, many companies are defining commitments, are using claims connected with their activity and their investment, also in forestry. Claims connected with climate protection. You see here in the first square quite a lot of example. Commitments, claims connected with biodiversity protection, and even general commitments connected with environmental protection, like net zero, net negative, science-based target network compliance, and so on. Some of these claims are associated with standards, means with not only principle, but criteria, indicators of management of the investments and of the forest activity. If we try to define what sustainable finance investment is, we have to take into consideration that there are many fields of implementation of this concept. Sustainable investing, like sustainable finance, is, as a matter of fact, an umbrella term. In general, we associate sustainable finance with the environmental, social, governance aspect of managing an organization, the ESG criteria. Sometimes, and more recently, we associate also this concept to the respect and the implementation of the target of the Sustainable Development Goals. More operational investments sustainable investment are aligned with some criteria indicator that may be defined by public authorities. That is the case of the European Union taxonomy, or by private operators or networks or private operators, both for profit and non-profit. We have also, we can use also the concept of green investments, where, of course, the focus is more on environmental protection, given that the already mentioned do no significant harm principle and criteria are respected. We add to this principle and criteria some elements connected with the positive effects on investment on the environment and on the forest environment. And even a narrower perspective is that of climate, biodiversity, or conservation investment finance. So some investments, a large amount of investments that are concentrated their attention on few environmental, even very important aspects. Which are the characteristics, the economic and financial characteristics of investment in forestry. The forest investments are a unique field of investments. There are some positive aspects connected to investing in forest. First of all, the diversified revenue components. When you invest in forest activity, you have to take into consideration that there is evidence of the long-term real price increase for timber and forest land, but also that you are investing not in a physical, stable asset, but in a biological asset that is growing itself. That is an important difference. And here you see the role played by the three components of revenue in the long term in forest-related investment. Another very important unique aspect is the inflation hedging effect of forest investment. Forest returns are generally positively correlated with inflation. And the return of investments are less correlated with the return of other financial assets. So forest investment are frequently considered a very useful small component when you have to create, where investors have to create a portfolio of strategies with the aim of reducing the risk component. And finally, but probably more important is the role played by positive environmental externalities. Forest investment can improve the green credentials of the investor, and they can increase the reputational value of investor. Unique characteristic of forest investment means also the presence of negative aspect. Of course, investment in forestry are normally long-term investments because the returns are much connected with the growth cycle of the trees. And there are disruptive factors, think to presence of storm, fire, pest, and floods. And this damages, potential damages, we know that are associated with extreme events that are becoming more frequent in the last years. And finally, there is a large number of local and external international stakeholders that are taking care and that are exercising critical roles towards such investments. And this is one reason for the increased transaction costs that may be implemented in designing and managing a forest investment. So that is all from my side. I think I gave you a minimum background of what does it mean investing in forestry. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Davide and Gert-Jan, for this quick introduction into the study background and also into sustainable finance and investments. I would like to again tell everyone that we have a Padlet online where you can put your questions. Sean, can you please put the link to the Padlet again into the chat box? Excellent. So please access this if you have questions and write it there. It's very easy to use. And I would suggest, while you're thinking about the right questions to our first two speakers, to go to the next two speakers, Yoan and Stefanie. Yoan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Helga. I will now share my screen. Normally, you should be able to see it. Well, thank you for giving me the floor, and I will talk quite rapidly about forest biodiversity-friendly measures to guide sustainable finance. The background is that basically forest harvesting reduces favorable elements for biodiversity, and as a matter of fact, you see the biological cycle of a forest, of a given forest, and if we speak about management, it's just management cycle about maximum of 200 years, and it is reducing due to climate change at the moment. And you can see it covers only nearly half of the biological cycle of the natural development of forests. So what happens is that some part of biodiversity are favored, of course, by management, but most of biological features and features favorable to biodiversity and biodiversity itself is more adapted to the biological cycle of a long term, on the long term. So this means that different forests and different types of forests have different contribution to biodiversity. And on this graph that is issued from the report, you can see that primeval, primary, and managed forests are at the left end of the species diversity. They comprise the higher species diversity levels. And then you have most of the European forests that are located in semi-natural multi-species forests, but they still have biodiversity, of course, but on a lesser level than primeval and old-growth forest. And on the other corner, you have like short rotation forestry, short rotation copies and plantation with exotic species that are meant to produce wood products, but still they harbor low species diversity levels. And you see at the bottom of this graph that several types of forest management that are indicated so that we can integrate biodiversity in classical forest management, and this is called integrated or closer to nature forest management. So this integrating forest biodiversity in forest management means that we can combine human needs to an ecosystem services with biodiversity conservation. And you have this representation on the right that opposes segregation, where you dedicate most of the forest to production and a small part to protection. And below you have integration that is meant to have a gradient of influence of nature and influence of humans to preserve biodiversity. And this acts at three levels, three components of biodiversity: composition, structure, and function, that I will detail further on. So to be clear, closer to nature forest management is not natural forest, of course, because there's still management. It's not a planted even edge mono-specific forest either. It combines several aspects, several species, and several functional features that mimic natural forest, but still allow to have some wood products and other products. So what does it mean to have closer to nature forest management? You have to favor diversity everywhere, at the gene level, the species level, and habitat level. And first thing is to favor the complementary habitat. Here you have a picture of a swamp forest in Bielorussia, for example. Then you have to increase species diversity with a picture of my place in the Alps. And with more species diversity, then you will favor more other species, of course. Third measure is to increase genetic diversity. Is an example of resistance of poplar to several diseases. And with increased genetic diversity, then you have more resilience and more production that is meant. And finally, you have to control invasive species. Here is a famous one, and because invasive species are detrimental to biodiversity. So this is about composition, of course. In terms of structure, you remember that forest management is detrimental to some forest structure. The quantity and qualities are lessened in managed forests. So the idea is to promote large and monumental trees, for example, to have deadwood of all kinds of forms, standing, lying, and so on, and also to promote tree-related microhabitats, which are singularities borne by trees. So this is a way to integrate biodiversity by promoting structural elements. And finally, at a larger scale, we have to enhance functional aspects. So this means networking, but not networking together, but make the biodiversity friendly feature in a network. And you have this famous graph that comprise forest reserves, old growth patch, and habitat trees that act as dispersal corridors for species. So the measure have to be taken into account at a landscape perspective. You have also to promote and conserve ancient forests. It means that these forests have been forested at least since the 19th century and still are. And in several countries now, you can find maps like the one presented that that allow to recognize these forests. Of course, conserving cultural landscapes is important because these landscapes that have been managed for centuries and have been able to, within a kind of a sustainable management framework, to conserve biodiversity, then they are very important to conserve. And finally, it's a controversial point, but we have to restore natural disturbances, especially in protected areas, because the features that are shown when the forest is naturally disturbed is not the same when the forest is managed. So that's it. I put here a few interesting references. They are interesting because there are syntheses and accessible syntheses of different things. And they, by the way, have all been published by under the auspice of European Forest Institute. First, this is the Closer to Nature Forest Management report dating back to a year ago, something like that. You have integrative approaches, and the third one is about concrete examples on how to set up those measures in forestry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yoan. I would like to give the floor immediately to Stefanie, please.
Thank you, Helga. I will share my screen. So it should work now. Do you see my screen? I hope. I can't hear anyone.
Yep.
Okay.
But we also see your notes, Stefanie. Maybe you go in full modus.
I try to be in full modus.
I think it's the 3 dots that you have to click.
Now?
Yes, better. But we still have to go in full modus. We see the without the comments.
I know, but it's not working, unfortunately. It's not working better.
Well, then we stay in this modus. It's fine.
Okay, I'm sorry. So good morning and greetings from BOKU Vienna. I would like to start right with a short introduction into the CNI terminology. As in the European Union or in the EU documents, the criteria are often used as an umbrella term for both the descriptive criteria and the subordinate indicators. And in the context of my work, criteria always relate to what is important to measure. And the criteria, they define the essential elements that should be assessed. And in contrary, the indicators, they relate to how to measure the elements of a criterion. And these indicators may be quantitative or qualitative. And for example, widely applied quantitative forest biodiversity indicators are the size of forest area or the amount of deadwood. And qualitative indicators are, for instance, instruments to maintain, conserve, and enhance biodiversity. A threshold is an amount or a critical level or a limit on a scale which should not be reached or exceeded in case of, for instance, a damage level, or which should be reached in case of a desired amount of, for instance, deadwood. And setting thresholds for forest-related indicators is very complex. We will hear about this later, as the ecological functioning of a forest depends on the local circumstances. And for larger areas up to national levels, it's very often only possible to agree on a very low common denominator. And targets are most often agreed values which should be reached, like a certain percentage of area under protection, for example. So what are now good indicators? The indicators should be, they should quantify information so that their significance is apparent. The data should be available or obtainable with present technology, and the indicators should be measurable at reasonable costs to allow for repeated tracking of progress and performance over the time. So this is the feasibility. The indicators need to be easily understandable to ensure that they can be effectively communicated to the target audience. And the choice of scale at which biodiversity is measured can significantly affect the interpretation of results and the ability to detect changes over time. And then the indicator should enable an assessment of the current situation with respect to a sustainable reference situation, thresholds or targets, which has been optimally chosen in a participatory process or agreed at political level. And the indicator relevance to policymaking increases if already politically decided threshold degrees or target levels exist to compare the indicator status. And here you can see a picture of a stag beetle. They are quite difficult to monitor, but the amount of oak deadwood is much easier to monitor and also expressive for being a habitat for many threatened species. And deadwood thresholds, for example, they are based on extensive research by Müller and Pülzl and other researchers. So this threshold information is available for our region. My next slide is on the taxonomy compass. This taxonomy compass is a visual representation of sectors, activities, and criteria included in the EU taxonomy, and it addresses 4 activities for forestry, which are afforestation, forest management, rehabilitation and restoration, and conservation forestry. And we use these 4 activities as a structure for the following proposed quantitative indicators. This table is now unfortunately quite small if you cannot see the whole screen. Here you can see the indicators displayed for afforestation. The table contains the indicators on the left side, highlighted in light blue. Then the second column is the information on monitoring options to obtain the data. The third column provides information on the biodiversity-friendly direction. The indicators should move over time. And the column on the right are the links and alignments to international strategies, laws, goals, targets, and existing indicators. And this is a very important column, as we have here chosen only indicators whose importance to have the respective information is already mentioned, either in the various EU strategies mentioned, or even globally, for example, in an SDG target, in the United Nations Strategic Plan for Forests 2030, or they are part of the global core set of forest-related indicators, or in the indicator systems of the European Environment Agency or of the Forest Europe process. As the time is limited here, I will not go in detail into the whole tables, but I want to highlight only some indicators, and I will start with the next slide. The indicators for forest management, very important. And here I want to pick the vertical diversity in the very last row. As my colleague Yoan already presented in his presentation, vertical diversity is very important through uneven aged trees and bushes. Data is available usually via management plan inventories or through remote sensing. The biodiversity friendly direction should be to maintain at high levels or to increase it. And as you can see in the very right corner, this is an indicator which is also covered by Forest Europe. It is part of the indicators in the nature restoration law, saying share of forests with uneven age structure. It is mentioned in the Climate Delegation Act, do not significantly harm 6H, ensure the diversity of stand structures in maintenance or enhancing of major stage stands and deadwood. Here are some more, just to give you the full picture of the indicators we presented in the report. Here are some more indicators for forest management assessment, like closer to nature and other forms of integrative forest management, clear cutting forest management, increment and fellings important indicator, biodiversity valuable traditional forest management or monoculture plantations. And the next activity is the rehabilitation and restoration of forests. Here I want to highlight the indicators on abundance of common forest bird species, so number assessed of breeding birds. This is usually monitored with volunteering networks, so data collected mainly by citizen science and increasingly also by acoustic recording. The biodiversity friendly direction is towards maintaining or improving and even restoring habitats for forest bird species. And as you can see also here in the very right part, it is as well a Forest Europe indicator. It is an CBI indicator of the European Environment Agency. It's part of the indicators in the nature restoration law, and it's also an indicator proposed in the EU framework for forest monitoring. And last activity, the conservation of forestry. Here we have also listed some indicators, and I want to highlight here the change in area of primary forest, as this is an indicator of the global core set of indicators, and this global core set is particular in the regard that this global core set indicator should be able to be monitored in all countries worldwide. And it is, for example, not part not yet part of Forest Europe, but it is an indicator proposed in the EU framework for forest monitoring, for example. And of course, biodiversity-friendly direction, no decrease, and measures aimed at some increase in the long term via increasing areas of old-growth forest and of set-aside forest, where the forest can get older and go back to a kind of primary stage.
Stephanie, can I kindly ask you to wrap it up, please?
Yes, my second last table. Here you can see how we linked my former tables with the biodiversity-friendly measures, which were presented by Yoan, and you can also see, so those indicators are usually linked to more than one biodiversity-friendly measure. And my last slide is on the qualitative indicators. This is also interesting because qualitative descriptive information includes usually policies, institutional instruments, management regimes, and traditional rights, and they can provide additional insights that quantitative data alone cannot well capture. And also insights on forest holdings, compliance with relevant laws, regulations, and permits are often of interest, and non-compliance can lead to legal and financial risks that may affect the investment's viability. And this qualitative descriptive information, this can be particularly valuable in situations where quantitative data may be limited or difficult to obtain, for example, in remote forest areas, hardly to access, and it can thus fill knowledge gaps and guide management and conservation efforts based on a holistic understanding of the ecosystem. And the main sources are, of course, often forest management plans, which are compulsory in many EU states for public forests at least, and for large private and community forest holdings. And with that, I give back to Helga. More information and all tables, indicated tables, are displayed in the whole report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie and Yoan. And I would like to have everyone look to the Padlet, and we have also some questions already put there. So please, Yoan, can you look at your questions on restoring with natural resource disturbance and public awareness? And there's even a second one coming in. Maybe we can try to answer this one first before we go to other questions.
Yes, that's a good question. I'm not a specialist about it, but about wildfire. I mean, but my idea is that a natural mimic natural disturbance like driven forest to deal with the wildfire risk could be presented as a way to enhance biodiversity if you don't include slash harvesting of residues, for example. And that would be my idea of restoring some kind of a natural control disturbance within a wildfire perspective. And the other question is about public awareness and sensitivity to this. Yeah, I think for this, we as scientists and natural area managers have to work more with the public, and maybe I don't know the name in English, but we need like a pole that is used for like a pilgrim pole, and use it to the end to promote those approaches and to make people understand that conserving deadwood in a forest, for example, is not a dirty or a negligent way of managing forest. I'm sorry, I don't have much answer on that, but that's what I can say about it.
Thank you. It's a complex question. But now let's have a look at the question for Davide, promoting local investments. Can you try to answer this one?
Yes. The question is quite complex because you should know exactly the partner, the context. But let's say at least the 3 points that you could stress in order to motivate an external investor to invest in an FSC certified forest? Well, first of all, very logical, FSC is the most recognized standard at international level for assuring a responsible forest management. That is one point. Of course, it's not a perfect system, but is that one that has been recognized as the best at world level. The second, if some specific environmental services that, like those one connected with water quality, water cycle regulation, and biodiversity protection are of special importance, you could ask that the certified forest be certified extending the FSC standard to the relatively new standards connected with environmental services monitoring. And a third element of consideration is that when you compare FSC with other standards, one of the most positive elements characterizing FSC is the stakeholder consultation requirements. So you could stress all this aspect and request evidence that the stakeholders consultation is organized in a proper way in order to take into proper consideration all the needs of the local stakeholders of the local population. That in short what I could suggest. Thanks.
Thank you, Davide. And we have also some questions to all. The first one from Sam about the forest structure. Who would like to answer this question?
I could give it a go.
Excellent.
And others can certainly complement. Yeah, the question is, well, he has forest and he speeds up the rewilding process or the natural process by introducing domesticated herbivores and machineries to speed up the natural process. And he asked whether we consider this approach as well. It's this sort of fast approach of it's almost like a rewilding or introducing natural processes in your forest. I think you could see it under our approaches of integrated forest management, a bit of set aside. It's a bit of in between there. And this is, we do not specifically mention that approach in our report, but it's in between these kind of approaches of forest management, what I would say. You're muted.
Sorry. Thanks, Davide. Somebody else would like to add something here? Not yet?
Sorry, Helga, you're muted.
Sorry. I would like to postpone the question on capitalism and sustainable forestry a little bit because we have the presentation from Sophus later on. But I would like to then jump to the question forest genetics. Stefanie, can you say something about what indicators are suitable here?
Yeah, thank you, Todora, for this question. I remember that you asked me this already in Stockholm. So forest genetic resources is not an easy are not easy indicators. They will be of more importance in the future for climate change adaptation. The data is not very good at local level, and here we talk about local level indicators, or at smaller, not at national level indicators, because this financing is more on local level or on regional level, or on a regional level, and the data on genetic resources is mainly not available. And also eDNA is a new option, but mainly also only applied on national level. So forest genetic resources on local level is something we need to put into more efforts, particularly for this purpose. And it will be of more importance due to climate change adaptation.
Thank you, Stefanie. Someone else wants to add here?
Yes. It's not about an indicator, but a way to promote genetic diversity is to promote natural regeneration, because when you use natural regeneration, then you have for sure a diversification of genetic resources within a same species compared to plantation. So this is not an indicator, but it's a direct way to promote genetic diversity.
Yes, and not only in natural regeneration, but also site-adapted, planted or seeded regeneration to cope with changing climate.
Science is very cool nowadays. The eDNA and other initiatives can also recover the DNA from air. It's fantastic. Maybe this is something that can also be helping out here in this regards. I have another question on cultural indicators connected to biodiversity. While Stefanie reflects on it, I would like to encourage participants in the seminar to post your question to the Padlet. Jean has just put the link into the chat box so that you can have a look at the Padlet. And we would be happy to try to answer your questions. But now back to Stefanie. Can you say something on this with regards to this question, please?
Yes, thank you, Mihai, for the question. I'm not quite sure I fully understand, because you know, in this exercise, the focus was not on sociocultural indicators, but only on biodiversity-related indicators. So, of course, for various sustainability assessments, also sociocultural or socioeconomic indicators are of importance. But for the purpose here, for green financing, we concentrated only on biodiversity indicators.
Okay, thank you, Stefanie. And last but not least, for this moment, I have a question on the UDR. Gert-Jan, would you like to give it a try?
Yeah, I can give it a try. Yeah, there is a question about the EUDR, and if I can share insights on that. And yeah, if the EU is entitled to define what is a degraded forest in third-party countries. Well, the EUDR, I'm not sure if most of the audience know it, but it's an obligation for importers of 6 or 7 commodities like cocoa and palm oil and wood and rubber, to trace the origin of that commodity back to where it came from. The importers have to have the paperwork or other kinds of proof to show that where it came from, and to prove that it did not come from recently deforested areas. That is, in very short, what the EUDR is. So the EU has several policies that push in the same direction. The EUDR tries to prevent deforestation. The sustainable investment tries to push the investments to a greener path, so that there's also a question somewhere else about the carbon farming. That also tries to stimulate investments in higher carbon stocks on land. So they all push in a certain direction. Well, this is my reflection on the EUDR. Whether the EU is entitled to define what is a degraded forest, yes, the EU can set, well, in principle, can set obligations on importers to certain rules that they have to comply to. And then you have to indeed define when is something deforested, when it's degraded. And yes, the EU can set certain specifications on what it is importing. So that will be my response to this.
Okay, thank you very much, Gert-Jan. Now that you had already the floor, I think we would like to... Oh, sorry, Davide, but make it quick, please.
Sure. Well, let's remind us, First of all, EUDR is applied also in the European Union.
Yeah.
And second point, the threshold, the reference is legality, is not sustainability. Stop.
Yeah.
That was a very important addition. Thank you so much, Davide. I would like to now continue with our last block. So I would like to invite Gert-Jan to share his screen again and talk to us about thresholds, targets, and monitoring aspects before Sophus takes over.
Let's see, am I sharing? Now I'm sharing. All right, very quickly, the last block with introduction. This is about targets and thresholds, and then Sophus will take over at the end. So Yoan already showed the large variety and management options that you have in forestry and biodiversity levels, and Stefanie showed the list of indicators. So can you, if we want to put this in between quotes, can you squeeze all of this in fixed targets? And because that is what a regulation has to aim for. Legal text has to aim for very clear targets. And forests are diverse, and they are very dynamic over time and space. And that makes, of course, putting that dynamic system into a legal text makes it very challenging. For example, here you have a recent set-aside. So in the 1980s, a piece of forest in the Netherlands has been put into a strict set-aside. And that relatively young strict set-aside do not immediately gain a lot in biodiversity. You can imagine that in this forest, well, maybe some species that are associated to very dark and moist circumstances, they might increase, but not all of a sudden you have a large increase in all sort of species of old forests. So it takes time. And it fluctuates over time, and that is something that you know you have to deal with in a legally binding text. But it is possible. We found with our group, and we that is also what the science says. It is possible to set workable thresholds. For example, deadwood, and Stefanie already indicated that it's a very good indicator for a lot of species. In Europe, there's very few old forests with a lot of deadwood. But so if you try to stimulate that, you will gain biodiversity, and have been large reviews have been made of the amount of deadwoods that may be desired. And there are some numbers there that when you aim for and when you set these thresholds at 20 to 30 cubic meters for boreal circumstances, 30 to 40 cubic meters per hectare for example, for mixed mountain forests, etc. You can set these thresholds a bit within a range, but specific for the type of region and biome that you look at, and that's the flexibility that such a system will have to have. And it is possible to set thresholds, for example, for soil disturbance. You can set thresholds how much physical damage or compaction there is allowed under a green investment. And you do not then always need to send very expensive field crews to the site or do the very intensive monitoring or sampling of the soil in a forest enterprise. There are novel technologies to keep track of that. And here you see with the radar assessment, air flown, so with an airplane, crews fly over a national forest estate, and they can assess crown heights, the forest structure, but they can also assess what is happening on the ground. And with the arrow, you can see the tracks of a harvester that has been there. And these tracks may only be 10 or 15 centimeters deep, but the radar can assess that. And that's a very novel technique to do that. And also other ways of monitoring, for example, for clear-cut size, that was also in the list of Stefanie. Here you see the border zone between Finland on the left and Russia on the east, where through remote sensing you can keep track of cover losses. So red areas are cover losses between 2000 and 2021. Blue is a gain in forest cover, so the cover has come back. And with these sort of assessments, you can assess the intensity of management, and the intensity of management says something about the biodiversity levels. For example, the same for riparian zones, which was also in the list by Stefanie. So all these, we keep pointing at these flexibilities that are needed, but also novel techniques that are around to keep track of this. And we have to realize that it is a natural system, it's a dynamic system, there's always uncertainty. And that is something that well, within a legal text, it has its challenges. Another one is, some assessments can be complemented by modeling. Here you see an assessment of the whole Bundesland, North Rhine-Westphalia, in the state of the forest is depicted by the bars that you see there. And under certain management regimes, you see the development of those bars, the growing stock and the structure to 2051. So it's partly monitoring, novel monitoring, but it's also complemented by modeling. Then you can assess these dynamics. You can assess many indicators this way. And we have to be happy with what we call here at the bottom a sufficient level of detail. You cannot know every butterfly and every fungi and every beetle. That's impossible. So it's possible to set these workable thresholds. We find there's a lot of information available. There's really huge amounts of information and many inventories going on. I showed the remote sensing examples as well. And we have to accept some level of uncertainty. That is part of the whole system. And then I will quickly give the word to Sophus.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, I was asked to talk about how this all fits in with the bigger picture about financing biodiversity and forests across the European Union. So the majority of this webinar has been based on the sustainable taxonomy, which is one of a big portfolio of policy and private sector and voluntary initiatives that are all going on at the same time to try and incentivize more private investment in biodiversity and forests. So I'm going to introduce the other parts of the story, how the EU taxonomy fits in with other things. Okay, so here is a slide from the recent State of Finance for Nature report by the United Nations Environment Programme. And basically, what the high-level takeaways that I want you to take away from this are, on the left-hand side, you can see the black and grey bar demonstrates what they call in this nature negative investment. So this is investment in assets that somehow destroy nature. This tiny bar on the left-hand side that's above the line, that demonstrates what they call nature positive investments. That's investments that are directly causing increases or improvements in biodiversity or forest quality and other kinds. And essentially, the purpose of all of these different kinds of initiatives is to reduce the amount of negative finance that's flowing into assets that destroy nature, and increase the amount of finance that flows into stuff that improves nature. And the terminology that we use in the kind of conservation finance, sustainable finance literature is financing green and greening finance. So greening finance is initiatives to try and change the flow of finance in the financial sector away from things that damage nature and towards things that have no impact on nature or improve it. But financing green is this other kind of approach, and this is a bundle of initiatives to try and increase the number of opportunities for deriving revenues from investing directly in improving nature. So we've got a bunch of initiatives that all work together. Lots of them are actually overlapping. So on the greening finance side, we have the EU taxonomy, the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, the EU Deforestation Law, various initiatives that are all there to try and put safeguards on the flow of money in the economy to try and stop it doing so much harm. Now, this is a lot about getting companies and organizations to report on their impacts and dependencies on nature, and often come up with some kind of plan for how they're going to reduce those impacts and reduce their exposure to risk through managing their dependencies. Now, lots of these mechanisms also help incentivize more investment in nature as well. Not only do they get companies to report on their exposure to risk, but many of these initiatives also try and get companies to report on what investments they're implementing to try and address their risk and deliver improvements in nature that help reduce their exposure to nature-related risk. On the financing green side, we have lots of different financial mechanisms, some of which are actually very old, but growing exponentially. We have a need for lots of new financial mechanisms, especially under the implementation strategies of the EU Restoration Law. So the EU Restoration Law, every country is going to have to come up with its implementation strategy. And those implementation strategies are going to have to include finance strategies. And I am, for example, giving presentations across to member states, the governments of member states all across Europe, about what we can learn about the existing kind of toolkit of financial mechanisms for attracting private finance into nature as part of the implementation strategies for the EU Restoration Law. And the kinds of financial mechanisms that we're talking about here might include biodiversity offsets, nature-based carbon offsets, voluntary carbon markets, biodiversity credits are brand new and emerging fast, environmental or conservation impact bonds, another kind of mechanism that is just starting to be used, natural flood management, something that has not really scaled yet, but there's a lot of people looking into it. Okay, so all of these things fit together. And really quickly, I'm going to give a quick overview of other ways that you can make money from investing in forests that aren't just through forestry. So this sits adjacent to the discussion around the EU taxonomy. So the way that these kind of mechanisms for financing green generate cash flows, obviously there is a huge diversity of mechanisms. So there is lots of different kind of institutional structures. But the big picture idea here is just like a kind of ordinary commercial investment, you might raise upfront financing, and that could be through issuing a bond, a loan if it's just from a single entity, equity in a kind of a structure, that's shares in a kind of organizational structure, or retained earnings. This is often going to happen in the context of agriculture. And basically you use this to invest in land management activities, but instead of selling timber as the commodity that you use to generate revenues, you might sell some kind of environmental improvement as the commodity that you are using instead. And you generate revenues from these kind of land management activities, and you use these revenues to pay back your investors, right? So that's how these kind of financial mechanisms work. We've actually been doing this stuff for a long time. Biodiversity offsets are something that have been applied in Europe for up to 50 years. The original biodiversity compensation system in Germany is nearly 50 years old now. And the French national conservation law had non-mandatory biodiversity offsetting also for many decades. And this is just a map of countries around the world where there is some form of mandatory biodiversity compensation policy embedded in their national legislation. You see, there's a lot of countries in Europe where there is some form of compensation required for the damages of economic activity. And biodiversity offsets are often seen by biodiversity finance analysts as one of the mechanisms that can most easily upscale. And that's partly because they're politically quite easy. A quick case study of how people kind of generate revenues from this stuff is a brand new biodiversity offsetting market in England. It's a new approach to planning and land management that aims to leave biodiversity in a measurably better state after development happens than before development happens. So every time you build a new piece of infrastructure, you need to leave biodiversity better off than it was before. It's mandatory as of this year under the Environment Act, and it requires achieving a biodiversity net gain of 10%. And 10% is measured using an Excel spreadsheet, which is their biodiversity metric. But basically, you visit a site, you look at the size of every habitat in your site, you look at what kind of habitat it is, that gives you what we call a distinctiveness score. And then an ecological consultant goes out and tells you what kind of condition it is in. And basically, you multiply all these things together, and it gives you a number for the value of biodiversity. And then what you need to do is you need to demonstrate that after your development is implemented, that number is going to go up. You do the same calculation again, but for what your development will look like in the future. And if that number doesn't go up by 10%, then you need to buy offsets. And that creates a market. or the potential to generate revenues through conservation or forest management that can then be sold into this market. So how can you make money from selling these kind of environmental commodities? I'm going to use the example of biodiversity net gain here, but this could be any voluntary carbon market. This could be Label Bas Carbone in France. This could be the UK's Woodland Carbon Code. This is just a general template for how you might be able to generate revenues from investing in forests without selling timber necessarily. So you might raise upfront financing through some kind of loan from a financial institution. You might then invest it in land management activities which deliver these biodiversity units, which is, we have our own way of measuring this in England. In England, the going price for each biodiversity unit is about £25,000. So you sell these to developers who can use these units to offset their impacts of development. And so when I talk to people who are implementing these kind of business models, basically what they do is they often sell some of these units up front to finance their ongoing management, and then they hold some of the units back. And that's because we have that's a specific accounting approach that we use in England, which means that the units gain value if you don't sell them early. But basically, there's ways you can structure your cash flows so that you can finance your conservation activities by selling some units up front and some units later on. And that can create a sustainable business model. And then you can use this to pay back your investor and generate profits for your land manager. In the UK or in England, you then legally have to safeguard those biodiversity outcomes for 30 years under biodiversity net gain. But this will vary from voluntary carbon market to carbon market, from biodiversity market to biodiversity market. And there's a lot of people who think that these kind of financial mechanisms are going to be a very important part of the picture for closing the global biodiversity financing gap. Basically, what this figure is a high-level assessment of how we can fund or how we can address the global biodiversity financing shortfall. And the authors of this particular institute, by the Pülzl Institute and colleagues, basically the red stuff is all about reducing perverse subsidies, and the green stuff is all about increasing investment in nature. And most of these are related to opportunities for increasing private investment in nature. And lots of these things will be structured around interesting new cash flow models that allow investors to generate revenues from investing in forest restoration, forest conservation, or other forms of conservation. So that's how this fits in alongside the EU taxonomy. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sophus. We can now we got very good insight into threshold targets and also what's the difference between finance and financing green, and a great example from Great Britain. Let us go back to our questions from the Padlet. We have received some more in the meantime, and there was this question on wait, I have to find it myself, on capitalist and sustainable forestry. From Amber. I was wondering, Sophus, if you can take a first turn on this question.
Which category is this under in the Padlet?
Helga, you're muted again.
Sorry, I'm too quick in muting. It's in the Padlet on questions to all. The second one. And Brian, can you please promote all scientists? Thanks.
Right, okay. Good question. So the question is, how can the EU's sustainable finance policies evolve to integrate capitalist incentives such as carbon markets and impact investing to not only ensure profitability in forest projects, but also drive systemic change towards achieving long-term sustainability goals? Yeah, okay. I mean, this has been a long-term initiative. People have been attempting to generate capitalist incentives for conservation management for about 50 years. The first recorded sort of biodiversity-related markets following the Brundtland report. They've been around starting in the United States in the mid-1970s. So we have a huge amount of evidence about how to do this stuff well. And there's as I just pointed out, I'm speaking to the governments of member states all across the EU to introduce new market-based mechanisms that are aiming to introduce capitalist incentives to basically internalize the damage of the economy into itself. So a big chunk of these new markets are aiming to take an economic sector that damages biodiversity and internalize the costs of that damage into that sector through the implementation of market mechanisms. Now, it doesn't have to be market mechanisms. There's lots of other ways that you could do this, but people like market mechanisms partly because they're more politically feasible, I think, even if they might actually be less ecologically effective than other tools. But I mean, there's lots of different, I can't give you a satisfying answer to your question, Amber, because there is, it's basically too big, right? There's some people who think that these capitalist incentives are fundamentally incompatible with a sustainable economy. There's some people who believe that these capitalist incentives are fundamentally, are going to form a fundamental component of a sustainable economy by internalizing the damage of the economy into itself. And basically, there's so much experimentation going on across Europe right now to try and create these kind of capitalist incentives. There's lots of stuff. I write lots and lots of papers about how you create these kind of market-based instruments in ways that deliver the best possible ecological outcomes. And we have a bunch of rules of thumb about how you can do this. I think if I had to summarize, the last 10 years of research in a sentence, is the key is actually the governance that checks that if you claim that you're delivering something, that it's actually delivered. And in the vast majority of cases, these capitalist incentive systems have done a lot of thinking about how this system might work, but they don't do a lot of thinking about the fundamental governance that can hold people accountable if they don't deliver what they promise. But that's what I think is the big challenge.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sophus, to summarize everything so quick in a short sentence. Now let's have a look at the other questions. There were quite some questions for Stefanie, but she seems to have answered it already in the text, but maybe you would like to address it quickly. The tree-related microhabitat question from Cyprian.
Yes, thanks, Helga. Yes, the indicator displayed was habitat trees, meaning old veteran trees with one or more tree-related microhabitats like stem holes or bark niches or deadwood within this still living veteran tree. And the measurement unit would be number per hectare, and very often used as a target are, for example, 5 habitat trees per hectare. And it's easier to monitor habitat trees than to count the single tree-related microhabitats. So this is simply a more easier indicator to monitor the habitat trees than to monitor the microhabitats itself.
Mm-hmm. And while I have you here, Stefanie, there is another question under questions to all from Mark, and it's about the alignment of the criteria of the report and the Eurobond EVBs. Not sure if you know that. If you can say something about it, it would be nice.
Yes, of course, I know the the Europa bond indicators and these essential biodiversity indicators. I do not know what the V stands for. Yeah, essential variables for biodiversity. And when we propose these indicators in this EFI report, of course, we screened these Europa bond indicators. But in our case, it was important that these indicators here, which we display, are already existing indicators. So and indicators which are of importance for EU instruments, like the various strategies mentioned, and are already included in some monitoring frameworks. And some of these Europa bond indicators are very new, where no data is, for example, available so far. So this is not really of help if we propose indicators where the data cannot be obtainable at present techniques.
Okay, thank you, Stefanie. And Mark seems to have another question to Sophus about what convinced the UK here. Can you maybe say something about how the UK government was convinced to make biodiversity net gain a legal requirement?
It's a very interesting and long story.
Oh, make it short.
Yeah. Basically, a couple of things. One, the UK government has completely contradictory policy objectives, and they needed to try and find a way to make both. So they have huge, very ambitious policy objectives towards increasing infrastructure and housing, and at the same time, very ambitious policy objectives towards halting biodiversity loss. So they needed to try and come up with some kind of policy mechanism that tried to ameliorate trade-offs between those two things. So there's a policy driver. And then the second thing was a lot of big developers saw the opportunities for biodiversity net gain as a way of developing competitive advantage in their own sector. So basically, a lot of the big developers went ahead and basically developed best practice years before this stuff became mandatory. And they used this to help build the evidence base that it could be done. They then played an important role in influencing and lobbying government to make this national legislation, so that when it became national legislation, these guys would have the competitive advantage. So it's a mixture of a policy driver and a kind of a business opportunity where individual companies used their power to help introduce legislation that gave them competitive advantage.
Okay, thank you very much for this quick answer. It's a very interesting case. Yoan, it seems you got a comment on your text. I wonder whether you want to say something about this.
You mean the FSC comment?
Yes, right.
Yeah, I answered already, but because I wasn't sure that we had time to answer. I think the FSC context is pretty much dependent on the country. That's what I was saying. So the example I know the most is for France, that FSC has a high environmental value standard for forest, and in this they pretty much considered deadwood as an essential habitat for biodiversity. So I don't know from which country Bogdan is and the situation of FSC there, but I guess those initiatives in FSC they tend to diffuse in Europe. So I hope that these standards will increase.
Okay, excellent, Yoan. We are quite advanced in time, so we would have the possibility to answer one more question, but I see that some people are writing, but we haven't received it yet. So I would suggest please finish your question. We can have a look at it later. But I would like to now wrap this Ask a Scientist event up. I would like to thank all the speakers. It was fantastic to listen to you. And I would also encourage everyone to have a look at our From Science to Policy study, where you can find even more detail. It's available on our homepage for free download. And we truly hope that you found this kind of seminar interesting. And with this, I would like to thank all of you for your participation and wish you a wonderful afternoon. So thank you very much and goodbye, and see you soon. Stay tuned. We will have more ThinkForest events in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So